Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at busting one of the big myths that slavery doesn't happen in countries like ours. It only happens overseas in developing nations, because our country has robust laws against these kind of things, right? Well, unfortunately, that couldn't be further from the truth. So we're joined again by Morgan. Welcome back.
Thanks, glad to be back.
Yeah, and she's going to shed some light on what slavery looks like in higher income countries, right?
Yeah, so modern slavery in the form of human trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, and sexual exploitation occur in wealthy countries such as the United States, UK, and even right here in New Zealand. The number of people falling victim to modern slavery in these high-income countries is actually far higher than we would imagine.
So it's happening right here under our noses.
Yeah, exactly.
And so what about countries like America? I believe that America's got one of the highest rates in the world of modern slavery, right? What does it look like in a place like the United States?
Yeah, so in the US, the amount of internal trafficking that occurs is honestly astonishing. And this occurs despite the government meeting recognized global standards for the elimination of trafficking. So while victims originate from almost every region of the world, the top country of the origin is actually US itself, which surprises a lot of people. The individuals in the US vulnerable to trafficking, sex trafficking in particular, are children in foster care, homeless youth, indigenous populations, particularly women and girls, and individuals with substance use issues or disabilities. And that's just when you look at domestic trafficking.
So that's trafficking within the United States?
Exactly,
okay.
Yeah.
And so what about trafficking where migrants are trafficked into the US, which is I guess something we hear about regularly. What does that look like?
Yes, as we've discussed a bit already, migrants are highly vulnerable to exploitation as they're searching for a better life for themselves and their children, and are therefore more vulnerable to deception when it comes to new opportunities. The US Department of State estimates that about 17,000 people are trafficked into the country every year.
17,000.
17,000. And these individuals include undocumented workers, asylum seekers, participants in temporary visa programs. And the forms of modern slavery they're subject to include both sex and labor trafficking. So traffickers compel victims to engage in commercial sex and to work in both illegal and illicit industries. This includes things like hospitality, agriculture, construction, factories, drug smuggling and distribution, religious institutions and salons. So, for example, there are full-on criminal networks that use deception to traffic women from Asia into the US to work in massage parlors. So once they arrive, their passports are taken and they're trapped indefinitely into both commercialized sex and forced labor.
So we're kind of talking about that thing we did in the first video where people arrive somewhere through coercion or deception, then they're found, so they arrive there illegally essentially, they're not allowed to work in these certain industries, and so they can't go to the authorities or to the police or ask for help, because then they'll be kind of, almost reporting themselves. Is that kind of like the way that they're trapped in there?
Yeah, so people don't have the same protections that people that are legally in the country do.
Is it like we touched on in the first video where it's generally poverty or, lack of safe migration options or lack of education that forces people into these vulnerable situations? Is that the same thing that's happening in the US?
Yeah, it's all of those. So in the US, migrant groups tend to have lower levels of education. They typically know little to no English. They have unlawful immigration status and a lack of familiarity with US employment protections, which really just makes them prime targets for exploitation. And on top of this, the jobs that these individuals are working in, particularly undocumented workers, are often unregulated and unprotected by the government. So though this work can be lucrative at times, such as unofficial construction work, it's not recognized, regulated, or protected by existing laws. So
they come over there to look for better opportunities, but once they find those better opportunities, there's nothing protecting them to give them the same rights that, say, someone else might be afforded, right?
Yeah, and when they are being taken advantage of, they often don't make complaints because they're fearful of deportation.
What about here in New Zealand? Personally, I used to think we didn't have it here, right? So it's easy to think of another problem for another country, or maybe in the US where there's a huge population base happens there, but doesn't happen here. But I'm suspecting that's not quite true.
Yeah, as much as we wish it didn't, modern slavery does exist in New Zealand, and the mindset that you just described is actually the problem and kind of perpetuates the exploitation here in New Zealand because people are just unaware. And in fact, Kiwis' lack of awareness has really led to these crimes going unreported for decades.
It's funny because I was talking to someone the other day and they weren't aware that slavery existed globally, let alone that we've had cases in New Zealand where people have been convicted for it, right, for true human trafficking.
And most people aren't, which is the horrible truth.
That's crazy. So as I'm sure you'd know that in 2021, the Trafficking in Persons report demoted New Zealand from a tier 1 nation to a tier 2 nation. Can you explain for everyone what that kind of means?
Yeah, so the TIP report is released annually by the US government and is ultimately ranking governments based on their efforts to recognize and fight against human trafficking. So tier 1 includes countries like the UK, the US, Australia, France, and other countries, and essentially means that even though high levels of trafficking do exist, the governments are meeting the minimum standards when it comes to the protection, the prosecution, and the prevention of trafficking. So the 2021 report demoted New Zealand to a tier 2 country, which basically just means that the government is no longer meeting these minimum standards, but is making efforts to bring themselves into compliance. The TIP report pretty consistently identifies New Zealand as a destination country for forced labor, so of foreign nationals. And again, we see the same group of vulnerable individuals at the center of this slavery and exploitation in New Zealand, which is typically migrant workers. But unfortunately, upon arrival in New Zealand, some migrant workers have inadequate employment contracts, are underpaid, overworked, and reside in really just terrible housing conditions.
And this was what happened in 2018 with the whole chorus thing, right? Where, from my understanding, the Indian and Filipino workers came to New Zealand and just didn't have adequate conditions, or were underpaid, or didn't have the right kind of employment contracts in place, right? And here they were installing fibre across New Zealand.
Yeah, so the fibre rollout really relied heavily on temporary migrant labor to meet the demand for the fibre construction. And the issue was Chorus used so many subcontractors and took a really, hands-off approach to them. And when it came to monitoring them and making sure they upheld labor rights standards, Chorus just wasn't very involved in that. And when Chorus did receive complaints in 2016, they just ignored them. And in the end, there were labor rights abuses for about, 100 of 300 of their subcontractors.
So a third of all those subcontractors.
A third, exactly, yeah. And these are people that are installing fiber into, our houses. And these were things like contractors not paying minimum wages. In some cases, workers were even told that they had to have, extended training that was unpaid, or that they even had to be, volunteering.
And I'd imagine that these people, even though that they know that the conditions that they're working in might not be, completely above board or fair, they'd be pretty reluctant in a new country where they feel like they're on this kind of, this temporary worker visa scheme to go to the authorities and complain. They don't want to rock the boat, right?
Yeah, so in this case, even though it was a total breach of New Zealand employment laws, the workers said that they didn't complain about their working conditions out of that fear of deportation. So they really essentially weren't aware of their rights. But there's so many reasons, why people don't file complaints. Firstly, many people, they don't even know where to start. They don't know where to go. There aren't really adequate resources for migrants on work visas. And it's also, not a guarantee that they know English. And some may be in debt to the people who granted them the visa, and therefore they're forced to work until they can pay that debt off. Migrant workers are often charged really excessive recruitment fees, and then they experience unjustified salary deductions to make up for those, while also having restrictions on their movement, so they just can't leave. Their passports are sometimes taken away, or their contracts are altered last minute once they arrive. So many migrants tolerate this exploitation due to these very severe power imbalances between the employer and the worker, where migrants are typically at the mercy of their authorities and have very limited options for upward mobility, and oftentimes they might not even be able to travel back to their home country because they don't have their identity documents.
I know there's another case with I think Faraz Ali, right, in 2016, where he brought down 15 Fijian workers to New Zealand on the promise of picking fruit for possibly up to $900 a week. And some of those same things happen there, right? Where they were forced to do this kind of education for $4,000 or whatever. And suddenly they come and they're on the back foot and they're in debt and they don't know where to go, right? Can you tell us a bit more about that case?
Yeah, it's wild how many New Zealanders don't actually know about this case. So Feroz Ali was the first person in New Zealand to be convicted of human trafficking. And he went to Fiji, as you said, and he specifically targeted really vulnerable families and promised them a better life, better life in New Zealand. And really, he capitalized on people's desires to work in a place like New Zealand, to earn wages in New Zealand. But he got people into the country on 1-month visitor visas and then kept them here past the expiry date. So then those workers were very fearful of the authorities finding out. And he was caught, exploiting the workers through withholding their pay, forcing them to sleep with nothing on an overcrowded floor in a basement in the middle of winter. And he would threaten them with deportation if they complained.
I read one of the workers' interviews where he said he worked like 12 hours a day for 6 to 7 days a week at like $5 an hour or something crazy, right? And I'd imagine that if you're here and you feel like you're going to get in trouble if you say something, you're just kind of like caught in a position where you've just got no good choice, right? What do you do? It's a really tough situation. Tell me, what is the government doing about these cases locally?
Yeah, so the good news is that the government created the Migrant Exploitation Protection Visa, which is supposed to offer workers who have been exploited a pathway to a new visa that's an open work visa. So instead of being, tied to an employer. And time will tell if it is an effective solution. I hope that it is, but the barriers to access are still going to be there. So the key will be making sure that it's widely accessible to migrant workers, in the appropriate language, that they're educated and aware of it.
So if you've been trafficked to New Zealand in some way, then when the government's not going to just send you back and re-traumatize you, they're actually going to start working with you and see how we can get you working here locally, legally.
Yeah,
is that kind of?
Exactly, yeah.
That's awesome. And I guess, like you say, time will tell to see how effective that is. And hopefully we don't have many more of these cases, right?
Yeah.
So considering all this, what's Tearfund's major response locally?
That's a great question. At Tearfund, we want to respond to this reality by, bringing awareness to the fact that modern slavery is a global issue that exists in every country of the world, regardless of the size of the economy or how much power a country has. And cases of trafficking should not go undetected in places like New Zealand or the UK or the US simply because of a lack of awareness or investigation. We believe that the exploitation of the vulnerable is a gross injustice and it has to be recognized, has to be prosecuted and prevented. And the thing is, we already have the resources to do that, we're just not doing it.
Well, thank you very much, Morgan. For me, it was news when I first started engaging with the subject that this happens in New Zealand, and as I'm sure it is for many of you too. And I think hopefully these videos will shed some light and empower people to talk about it, right? So when you're around the water cooler, you're sharing these stories with people that, might actually shed some light that actually, hey, we've got to be aware in this country, in New Zealand, that this is happening. And hopefully, we're doing our bit to take action and stop this globally.